Today we're going to go through virtue ethics. So as we talk about virtue ethics, we're going to look at a different way of approaching ethics than we have seen so far. And we have a quote to start this off from Leslie Stevens. Morality is internal. The moral law has to be expressed in the form of be this, not in the form of do this. The true moral law says hate not instead of kill not. The only mode of stating the moral law must be as a rule of character. So you're going to see that we've had different approaches to looking at ethics, from commands that we ought to follow, whether they're based on reason or divine origin, or what we could affirm or wish that everybody else would do, or we've tried to look at ethics as something that produces a certain amount of a state of affairs with utilitarianism. So as much good as possible, things like that. And this approach is going to be very different because this approach is focused on who the individual is rather than what the specific actions are. So this is going to be a little bit different, so a different way of approaching ethics. Now, we get the idea of virtue ethics, and just a word you need to be familiar with here is Areatic. It comes from arete, which means excellence or virtue, so that's the Greek root. The focus is on the agent rather than the action. The character of the individual is important. And so the critique that you have from virtue ethicists is that you have too shallow or too bland of an understanding of ethics when you simply focus on behavior and not on character. So the action-oriented ethics, which is what everything we've talked about before, is we're trying to determine which action is the right or wrong action. The virtue ethics critique of that is that you need to focus on who you are as a person and being the right kind of person, because the right kind of person will do the right kind of things. They will do the right behavior. And it won't be out of duty or trying to maximize good. It will just be a flow of who they are from their character. So that's one of the critiques that virtue ethicists make against other approaches to ethics, is it doesn't focus on who you are. It just focuses on what you should do. So actions then are determined as being ethical or unethical, and the virtue ethicist is more focused on the person being a moral person than focusing just on whether an action is a particular way, if an action is good or bad. Maximilian Kolbe, we mentioned him before briefly, and we're just going to talk about him a little bit. He was a Polish Catholic priest. He was a prisoner in Auschwitz. And the story with him goes along that he was in the camp and a prisoner escaped. And what the Germans did, when one prisoner escaped, they took 10, in this camp anyway, they took 10 other prisoners and they put them in a cell that was in a kind of a public area. I believe it was kind of down under the ground, but it had windows or kind of cracks in it so that you could they could get some circulation and they could hear kind of what was going on and things like that. And so when a prisoner escaped, they chose 10 people, 10 other prisoners, and put them down in this cell and starved them to death. So that was the punishment. So a prisoner escaped, and they were lining up people and deciding who the 10 were going to be that were going to be thrown in there and starved to death. And as one of the men was being selected, he cried out that he had, what about his wife and children if he died? And so Maximilian Kolbe was not selected, but he convinced the guards to allow him to take the place of this man. So he substituted himself for this younger man with a family. And so they let him do that. Now, normally what happened, as the story goes about this, is that it would be very brutal and harsh. The people who were put into this pit to starve to death, or this cell, this place, would typically just be very angry, and they would be brutal to one another. You know, there would be fighting and all that kind of stuff. It was a terrible experience, and it was a long, drawn-out experience. Starving someone to death would be. Of course, the men in the camp probably were underweight anyway, so it wouldn't have been as long as perhaps if we were to be starved to death. But it was, in no doubt, a very horrible way to die. And so it was normally a very brutal practice, and there would be screaming and wailing and all these kind of things as people pleading from the cell, and that was to dissuade the other prisoners in the camp. Don't do this. If you try to escape, then 10 people will have to suffer this. So don't do that. So they made it was where people would be exposed to the suffering that they have as a way to deter the behaviors they didn't want. So that was the normal practice. But Kolbe, being a priest and having spent his life learning how to train, or how to take people through difficult experiences and how to shepherd them, if you will, he eased the suffering of these prisoners. And so because he was down there as a shepherd, instead of the wailing and fighting and stuff, they ended up singing hymns. And so the suffering was reduced greatly because he was there caring for those men as all of them were being starved to death. And so the story goes that after they had been in there and they thought most of the people had died, the guards came into the cell to check and make sure everybody was dead, and that they found Kolbe leaning against a wall or something, and they described him as a living skeleton, but he was still alive, and he had kind of a serene look on his face, and maybe even a smile, and they ended up having to give him an injection of poison to kill him. And so that's, this man eased a lot of suffering, and he was canonized by the Catholic Church, which means that he was declared a saint in the Catholic Church in 1982. So the question here is, why would someone like this, how would someone do this? Was this the moral choice for him to do it, and how would he do that? And the virtue ethicists will point out that this man had spent an entire lifetime of building character, caring for others. And so when it came to the point where he had to make a decision about whether he would substitute his own life for this other man's life, it was not something he had to debate. He didn't have to do a calculation about the amount of suffering that would happen, or all of these different things that we've looked at with other ethical approaches. He just knew what to do because he was a moral person. He was someone who had developed those qualities, those virtues over his lifetime. And so he's kind of an example that we can look at here to point to and maybe help us understand a little bit of the importance or the perspective that virtue ethicists take. Now, another term you need to know is Eudaimonism, okay? And this is the concept that moral activity is the kind of thing that it leads to a good life, okay? It leads to well-being. And so this is the idea that we are supposed to be moral creatures, and so as we live moral, then that's going to is going to produce more well-being in us. Okay, so by practicing virtues, people will flourish and be able to live a good life. So the idea here is not just you don't just have an obligation to do certain things that are right or wrong, or that are right, rather than to do things that are wrong, but that when you do good, and as you develop these virtues, then you become a better person, you become more properly human, if you will, and you live the way that you are supposed to live, and that it is good for you. So this is very much based on early in the class when we talked about the idea of, is the good for you? And is living a moral life, is there some benefit to living a moral life regardless of the consequences? When we asked about Jack and Jim and whether you would want to be Jack or be Jim. And the idea for the virtue ethicist here is very much that you will have a better life on the whole if you are moral. And so when we talk about what makes things a better life, sometimes we focus on physical things like money and possessions and things like that. And those may not actually make your life better, particularly from the virtue ethicist perspective. What makes your life better is being authentically, genuinely human as you should be. And that is not something that is measured in terms of physical adornments or possessions, things like that. It is based in character and who you are and the actions that you do. Now, the virtue ethicists critique other ethical approaches because they are missing concepts. They say that these other things are minimalist ethics and they're missing these other concepts. Morality is, as the slide says here, coterminous with human life, and it's unrestrictedly pervasive within it. So our morality is not something that can be compartmentalized. It is what it means to be human. It's pervasive throughout being human is our ethics. And so our character drives our ethics. And so if you have a system of ethics that does not consider the character of the individual rather than which behaviors you should do, then you have too shallow or too minimal a view of ethics. Everyone has a duty to develop properly our moral sensitivities here because that's part of the maturation process, and it's what it means to be human. So this is a duty, kind of like it's a duty to grow up into being an adult. It's not something that is an obligation in the same kind of way that an obligation would be seen under, say, a Kantian view or a utilitarian view of behavior, but it is kind of a process we should and must undertake, and we can either do it well or do it poorly. Now, the idea of virtue ethics is very much an ancient idea. We're going to look at a quote here from Aristotle. He writes about this, and certainly we have seen him before. We've talked about Aristotle before. Man, when perfected, is the best of the animals, but when separated from law and justice, he is the worst of all, since armed injustice is more dangerous. And he is equipped at birth with arms, meant to be used by intelligence and excellence, but which he may use for worst ends. That is why, if he is not excellence, he is the most evil and savage of animals, and the most full of lust and gluttony. But justice is the bond of men and states. For the administration of justice, which is the determination of what is just, is the principal order in political society. So Aristotle, interestingly, addresses ethics under politics. And so this is part of the bond which allows people to function together, is this idea of justice, and we have to have excellence, which are going to be the virtues here, or this proper behavior, this good way of being human. And Aristotle says that human is, when perfected or complete, which would include this excellence, is the best of animals, so the best of what can be here on the earth. But when we're not living this way, we can be the worst because we have arms. Okay, he's not talking about arms just with like our appendages, but we have these talents and skills we can use, and we can use them for good or bad. So if we don't have excellence, if we don't have this moral character, then we can be a very terrible person. So if we have moral character, we can be very much pursue justice and truth and all of those things that are good. And if we don't have that character, then we can pursue our lusts and evil and destruction and things like that. So we can be much worse than any wild animal could do. So just as we can have a very civil society, we can also have a very savage society if we do not have excellence, if we do not have the virtues. So Aristotle is very much an advocate of that. Now, virtue ethics holds that we have a primary responsibility to our community, and we must see each other as being in each other's debt. So I have a responsibility to be as good a person as I can because I am in a community where you live, and you deserve neighbors who are as good people as they can be. And likewise, you have the responsibility to me and to everyone else in the community that you can be as good of a person as you can. So we're in each other's debt, and we owe that this excellence to be as good a person as we can. Now, true goodness is spontaneously, cheerfully, and enjoyably to do what is good. Quoting Aristotle again, we may even go so far as to state that the man who does not enjoy performing noble actions is not a good man at all. Nobody would call a man who does not enjoy acting justly nor generous, call a man just who does not enjoy acting justly, or generous who does not enjoy generous actions, and so on. So, there needs to be an element of virtue ethics that it has been incorporated into your person, that you are satisfied and get pleasure from doing what is right, that you're doing it not begrudgingly or out of a sense of duty or requirement, as much as you, since it is the right thing to do, then you naturally do it, and you are naturally receive, joy or pleasure or some kind of aspect like that from doing it. And Aristotle says, the person who gives begrudgingly is not a generous person. They may be giving, but they're not a generous person. A generous person is someone who gives and enjoys giving. A just person is someone who acts justly and enjoys acting justly, not that they're doing it by fear of penalty or something else. So there's an aspect here of the virtue shaping who you are as a person, and then you delighting in the type of person that you are by performing those actions. Okay? So there are not just moral virtues, there are intellectual virtues as well. So, and those would be behaviors that make you intellectual as you should be, or thoughtful. Okay, so intellectual virtues may be taught and learned. You can learn about them more in a classroom. Moral virtues, however, must be lived to be learned. So the classroom for moral virtues is our life. In other words, if forgiveness is a virtue, or kindness is a virtue, you don't just learn about the process of how to forgive someone or how to be kind to someone. You must actually forgive. You must be kind. So you must do acts of kindness. You must practice forgiveness if you want to develop those. Whereas learning how to study and how to think and logic and things like that is appropriate for a classroom. The classroom for morality is the lives that we live. Aristotle did not spend a lot of time defining moral principles, but he focused on the importance of a good upbringing, habits, self-control, courage, and character. So it's not so much for the virtue ethicists, and particularly Aristotle here, what principles we should try to uphold, but rather the practices that will naturally develop the kind of life that reflects the principles that are important. So, proper upbringing. Teaching your children the right way to function and how to be the type of person that they need to be. So good habits. Okay, so the bad habits we have are things we should try to get rid of, and you should develop the good habits there. Why? Because habitual behavior is easy. It's once you've developed the habit, it's easy to do. And so if you develop good habits as it relates to kindness and courage and those kind of things, then it's easier to do that. Self-control. Obviously, one of the big things to deal with controlling ourselves, self-control is, it has to be developed. We don't learn how to deny the things we want in the immediate so that we can have better things in the future. That's not a natural response. Natural is more instant gratification. And so we have to teach that to our children, and we have to learn that ourselves. Courage, character, those kind of things, we need to raise or rear our children in a way that develops these characters. And in ourselves, we have to, as we know about this, we have to use techniques and practices that will develop these characters. And so without these things, you can't have a moral life at all. So we've got moral and non-moral virtues. We've got a list from Aristotle here, and so we're going to kind of be wrapping up with this. But the moral virtues are going to be honesty, benevolence, non-malevolence, fairness, kindness, conscientiousness, gratitude, and those are going to be some of the moral virtues. The non-moral virtues would be courage, optimism, rationality, self-control, patience, endurance, industry, musical talent, cleanliness, wit. So these are kind of a list from Aristotle here, so you can see it's very much in his time. But the point here, so you can you can develop some of these non-moral virtues, and you can develop the moral virtues. And so where musical talent is really not a moral issue, but he saw it as a virtue, a good thing that we should have, something that we should develop as properly being humans. And so this is the list from Aristotle. You'll find different focuses from different of the lists of what the virtues are from different virtue ethicists as you read about them. So this is virtue ethics, and it's a different approach from the other approaches that we have seen so far throughout the classroom or through the class. And hopefully this will, give you some insight then into how we can approach ethics. Did we miss a slide? I guess we didn't. Okay. All right. Well, I'll see you in the next video.